Well, good evening, church. Can you believe we're finishing another book on a Wednesday night? Book of Esther coming to a close. You know, I always feel very mixed when we finish a book on a Wednesday night. Part of me feels, just grateful for what we've learned along the way. Part of me feels a little tinge of sadness as I feel a little connected to the characters, and it feels almost like you're saying goodbye in a way. But there's also this excitement and this anticipation for what's the next book that we're going to study together. So I'm real excited for the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, which will be starting January 4th. So just a quick reminder that we're not meeting next week, the 21st, or the week after, the 28th. We're sort of taking a little break around Christmas and New Year's, but we will resume 1st Kings on January the 4th. So sometimes when we have a dinner together as a family, we'll just ask each other questions just to kind of get the conversation going. And my son Caleb, who's 3, he always asks the same question every single time. It's so predictable. And he always wants to know, what's your favorite movie? So he always asks us, what's our favorite movie? And, at first I really had to think about it because, as you know, that's kind of a tough question. There's so many ways you could go with it. But what it's done is it's helped me solidify, I know with confidence what my favorite movie is now. And it's What About Bob? Have any of you seen What About Bob? Okay, a lot of you. It's a Bill Murray, Richard Dreyfuss classic. And I just love this movie. And one of the things that I love about it, besides the ridiculous humor, is it's like the ultimate plot of reversal. Everything that you think you know at the beginning of the movie gets flipped on its head. So you've got Bob Wiley, played by Bill Murray, and as the movie opens, he's this hypochondriac, kind of psychotic guy, think COVID Nazi before there was COVID, who never leaves his apartment, barely can make it out the door to go see his psychologist, and he's a mess. And his psychologist is so frustrated working with him because he's just hopeless that he gets one of his colleagues, Richard Dreyfuss's character, Dr. Leo Marvin, to take Bob as a patient. Dr. Marvin is like pristine. He just wrote this best-selling book called Baby Steps, and he's this psychologist who's at the top. He's got the little bust of himself on his desk, like he's the top. And basically, if you've never seen it, throughout the movie, everything flips on its head. And Bob goes from being this loner to seeking out Dr. Marvin on vacation with his family at Lake Winnipesaukee. And he sort of worms his way into the family, and he's so childlike and beloved that his kids start connecting with him instead of their dad. And everyone just loves Bob except for Dr. Marvin. And it all culminates in this Good Morning America interview, and Leo Marvin freezes, and Bob's the star of the show, like the star patient, And anyway, the movie ends basically with Dr. Marvin losing his mind. And there he is, unable to speak, in a wheelchair as Bob is marrying his sister. And it's just the ultimate irony of a reversal from start to finish. The two characters have absolutely flipped on their heads. The reason why I bring this up is because that is the book of Esther, right? Everything that we knew, or we thought we knew at least at the beginning of the book, by the end, which is where we're at now, has been totally flipped. It's been turned on its head. And I just wanted to point out some of the key reversals in this book and how it changed from where we started to where it ended. So I've got a slide for this. These are just 7 that I picked. So the book opens with a proud king throwing a party to honor himself. Well, it closes with the Jews throwing a party to honor God's faithfulness. Queen Vashti is banished for refusing the king's command. Queen Esther successfully overturns the king's command with the help of the king, at no less. Jewish people start by hiding their identities from the Persian people. And it ends with Persian people publicly identifying with and joining the Jewish people. The enemies of the Jews, specifically Haman the Agagite, right? But more than that, plot to annihilate and destroy them. And yet, but when we conclude, the enemies of the Jews are the ones who are annihilated and destroyed. Haman, of course, builds this impalement spike for Mordecai, and yet Haman himself is impaled on his very own spike. Haman is obsessed with public honor, and only Mordecai stood in his way. And then tonight we'll see the humble Mordecai is now publicly honored as someone truly great, and Haman is publicly ridiculed in his death. And then, of course, Queen Esther, she's willing to lay down her life for her people, but instead of losing her life, her obedience leads to the salvation of both her and her people. And there's more, right? Everything that we thought we knew about these characters is totally flipped, and it's all because of the unnamed sovereign hand of God. What a powerful story. You know, What About Bob is humorous, and it's all based on Bob, but this is all based on God. And the author points to this. So we're going to do chapters 9, and because 10 is so short, obviously finishing the book, we're doing both tonight. So let's start with verses 1 and 10, and notice how the author even points out that a reversal has happened. And we'll kind of unpack this as we go. So it says, "Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred, a reversal. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all the peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man, Mordecai, grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies, with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed, bear with me now, Parshandatha and Dalphon and Aspatha and Paratha and Adaliah and Aridatha and Parmashta and Erisai and Eridai and Vizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hand on the plunder. So now we've got kind of this story that starts with the nation at large, and then it zooms in to individuals, right? Specifically to Queen Esther. Well, Queen Esther, her plot, her conflict, her crisis is resolved, but now we're zooming back again, and it has to do with the nation, the Jews, the Jewish people as a whole. And we see now sort of the conclusion of the matter. They are delivered by the hand of God. And notice a few things that really stick out. First, the fear of God, and specifically the fear of Mordecai, right, falls over the people, which really should remind us of what God did when the nation of Israel was coming out of Egypt, right? And the fear of Yahweh falls on all the surrounding peoples. And so no one is willing to lay hands to try and fight the Israelites, that is, until the Amalekites, where King Agag came from, right? They were the first ones to attack Israel. But the fear of God came upon and protected the people of Israel during that time. And the same thing happens now, right? No person can bring about great fear. Yes, it says that Mordecai, they feared Mordecai, but only because God had risen him higher and higher and higher into position of authority to where he's now number 2. He's like the Joseph to Pharaoh of King Ahasuerus. And what's really surprising, this is kind of, it all goes to plan, right? They had the opportunity to fight back anyone who would attack them. We see that 500 men in Susa are killed, all of Haman's sons. But at the end here is kind of a surprising statement. But they laid no hand on the plunder. If you remember in Haman's original speech to the king to try and convince him to bring forward this edict, the loot, the plunder, played a significant role. It was what he put forward to say, this is going to be very good for you, King Ahasuerus to kill the Jews, because then all of that money is going to go into the royal treasury. And King Ahasuerus, who is still trying to build up his armies to fight Greece again, is delighted at the prospect of filling his coffers, right? To have more plunder. But in this case, the opposite happens. Not only do the Jews prevail, but they don't take the plunder. And there's a couple of significant reasons, one of them being very theological, tying all the way back to the story of King Saul and King Agag in 1 Samuel 15. And so I just want to briefly look at verses 13 through 16 of 1 Samuel 15. What was it that tripped Saul up in the first place when he was told to wipe out the Amalekites? Well, he kept the plunder. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." And Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen that I hear?" Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have devoted to destruction." Then Samuel said to Saul, "Stop! I will tell you what the Lord said to me this night." And he said to him, "Speak." And then Samuel goes on this rightful tirade against King Saul and how God was going to reject him as king, had rejected him as king, because not the people. King Saul got greedy and allowed his men to keep the plunder and to spare King Agag. This is what got the Israelites into trouble from the beginning, and why there was Haman the Agagite to begin with, because they didn't finish the job. They were tripped up by their greed. And so it's this poetic justice that now the Jews in Persia have the opportunity again to plunder their enemies, and yet this time they say, "No, we're not going to do it. We're going to set right what was wronged by King Saul generations before." Now, another very practical reason in refusing to take the plunder is it also is going to buy them an awful lot of goodwill amongst the people of Persia, isn't it? Because it kind of proves we're not doing this for the reward. We're not doing this for plunder. We're not doing this for revenge. We're doing this out of self-defense, the purest of motives. There's no gain other than not dying. So we see again, as we've seen over and over in the book, when they need it most, God provides and protects his people. Let's look at verses 11 through 15. That very day, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, "In Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. It's amazing that King Ahasuerus is now directly asking Esther, like, what more can I do? How can I help you, right? It's a complete about-face from his edict with Haman against, although he didn't know it was the Jews. And he's continuing to say, what do you want from me? And it's just, again, it's this ironic reversal of, remember when Esther was trembling for 3 days at the thought of going into his presence to ask for his help? And now he's like bending over backwards to help her. What else can we do to help you? And here we have a place where a critic might say, now hold on a second. You just said that the Jews were doing this for pure motives. It was purely for self-defense. And now Esther is making some very unusual requests that look an awful lot like she's getting vindictive revenge on her enemies. Can we have another day to destroy even more of the enemies and those 10 sons of Haman who are already dead? Like, let's make a public display of them by basically they're going to impale him, right? Impale him publicly for all to see. This doesn't feel, at least on face value, like pure motives just trying to protect your people. But really there's a lot of incredible wisdom behind these requests. And although you might try and make the argument critically, if you look at it from the other side of the coin, this is Esther asking the king to be merciful. Here's how. They just killed 500 men in Susa. And the capital city, the citadel, appears to be at least where there's the most anger and hatred towards the people, right? That's where Haman was. That's where it's kind of the bastion of opposition to the Jewish people. And now 500 people are dead, and even though the king's edict only gave them permission on one day to go and pursue the Jews, they have a very strong social and cultural dynamic of why they need to go and get blood guilt revenge on the Jews for killing their family members, right? So it's not that the Jews are going to seek revenge. Esther is anticipating that those who already died, they're going to have friends and family who are now going to try and get revenge on them again. So all she's asking is for permission to defend themselves again. Okay, that kind of makes sense, but why display Haman's sons on impalement spikes? Like, that just seems over the top, right? Not really. Not if it's serving as a warning to a foolish man or many foolish men to say, don't make the same mistake that these guys did. You tell me, is it merciful to warn a fool before they go and take their life into their own hands and throw it away? Absolutely. Have you ever seen those really, really dramatic DUI commercials? I was watching it's a while back now, but it was some sporting event, and they had this one where they reenact like the police knocking on the door and telling the mom that her son just got in a car accident of his own doing because he drank too much. And then the mom and the daughter comes in right then, and they just fall to the ground weeping, and then it's like, this could be you. Like, don't drink under the influence. And it's like, I appreciate the warning, but as I'm watching it, I'm like, wow, that felt really heavy-handed, like, my goodness. But I see what they're trying to do, right? They're saying, hey, warning to the wise. Like, if you don't want to die, don't get behind the wheel intoxicated. Well, that's what Esther is saying. If you guys don't want to throw your life away tomorrow, then don't be like those 10 guys who tried to wipe out innocent people and were killed instead of it. You see how it's actually merciful? And so the king agrees. Let's keep reading, verses 16 through 19. Now, the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. So now we get the count, not just in the citadel of Susa, but throughout the whole Persian Empire, all 127 provinces. 75,000 people tried to attack the Jewish people and failed and lost their life. And there is a grand count of 0 Jews who lost their life in this. I mean, it's an overwhelming victory for the people of God. And now their response is celebration. And this brings up a really interesting question. When God works in your life, when he shows himself faithful, how do you respond? Do you respond? Do you take time to truly celebrate? Do you mutter a quick thank you, God, and continue on with your busy life? I mean, I know I do sometimes. I just kind of, oh, thanks, God, that was really awesome. And then I'm very quick to focus on either my next problem or all the things that are going well. I love the example here. They take time to feast, to celebrate, to give gifts. I mean, honestly, this sounds a lot like Christmas, doesn't it? A day for gladness and feasting as a holiday, which they send gifts of food to one another. Like we do this every Christmas with plates of cookies, and Chris Johnson was handing out caramels to us last week. Thank you, Chris. I mean, this is awesome. They are responding with celebration. When I was an RA in the dorms at Multnomah, one of my jobs was to plan events for our dorm section. And really, sometimes it was kind of spiritually focused, but mostly it was just give the guys a break. Give them something to look forward to, something to distract them from studying all the time. And so we planned fun stuff, and I remember so many of the guys in my section being so busy that they wouldn't come even to fun events unless we made them. So we kind of had this running joke, and we called it forced fun, where it's like, you have to come. I'm putting the time. We had a little budget, and you have to come have some fun and take a break where I'm forcing you to have fun. That's what God does for his people throughout the Old Testament, giving them 7 different celebrations, feasts, times where they can enjoy his faithfulness, some in the past, some in the present. We have the Passover festival, the Festival of Weeks, Festival of Tabernacles, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of First Fruits, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. 7 moments of forced fun for his people, the Israelites, where they had to take time, the whole nation collectively, to just enjoy, to celebrate, to feast. That sounds pretty darn good, doesn't it? It's so fascinating that sometimes people have a view of God that's something like this. God is stiff, he's a killjoy, and all he wants to do is keep me from enjoying life and having a good time. That's how they view God. And as a result, many have left the Christian faith in pursuit of just looking for a good time, just wanting to have some fun, thinking there's no way that you could find that under all the rules and commands that are found in the Bible. But that's really bad theology, isn't it? Because the same God who created fun and laughter and food and drink and sex and friendship and community enjoyment, like God created all of those things for us to enjoy. And he gave his people opportunities where it wasn't even optional, where you are going to enjoy being together. You're going to enjoy my faithfulness. Does that sound like a terrible, stiff God who you wouldn't want to follow? It's the exact opposite. Our God is a God of joy. You think about Jesus, and Pastor Todd talked about this on Sunday, right? Jesus was never accused of being a stiff killjoy who never had a good time. Jesus, the display for us of the character of God in human form, was accused of, he's always having a good time. He's always partying. He's always out there eating and drinking, going to people's houses, sharing meals. I mean, for goodness sake, his first miracle was just to keep the party going in Cana, right at the wedding. Like, keep the wine going. We're partying. We're celebrating. That was Jesus' criticism because that reflects God's heart. Now, I have a confession to make. I struggle with seeing celebration as an act of worship. Let me give you an example. I remember when Sabrina and I were working on our budget. This was some years back. And we wanted to just, we had some money going to missions and all the normal stuff, bills and all that, but we wanted to just set aside some money that was kind of open-ended. So we just called it kingdom investments. And the idea was that we would have money available so that when an opportunity to build the kingdom would come up, we'd have resources to do it. And I really like this, but I remember specifically one time when we both kind of felt led that we wanted to invite this other family out to share a meal. And so I was debating in my head, how am I going to budget this? And here's where the guilt came in, okay? I felt guilty taking money from a fund that was supposed to go to Kingdom Investments and having it be spent on something that I enjoyed, like going out to eat. I felt like I was cheating. Like somehow maybe we could divide the bill in half, and half of it for the other family comes out of Kingdom Investments, but the part that we enjoyed for my food, isn't that supposed to come out of food budget or something? Like, what it revealed in my heart was that I felt guilty. There was a disconnect for me between realizing that God actually wants me to enjoy. Like, He created community. He wants me to enjoy meals with other people. And just because it was something I enjoyed didn't mean it was wrong. See, that's bad theology on my part. You see what I mean? Like, the fact that it was something I enjoyed, I thought, that can't be right. Like, that can't be. What if I abuse this? What if I start, Kingdom Investment, and I'm buying stuff just for myself. And it's, well, yeah, you could twist it. You can always twist good things. But that's not God's heart. I wonder if any of you have also struggled with this. I would imagine that there's probably some extremes, and maybe you find yourself in the middle, where some of you might say, no, I don't have a hard time celebrating and partying. The more, the merrier. Like, let's do this. For some of us, maybe you're more like me, where it's like, I don't know. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know where the root of that is, but I know it's wrong, and I know it's in my heart. And I'm trying to get over it, that God actually is pleased if I'm worshiping Him with other people and I can enjoy it, and that's okay. Maybe some of you feel like, yeah, I've seen both. I don't know where you lie. But what I know for sure is that God wants His people to celebrate, and that's what they do. Look at verses 20 through 22. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Mordecai, in his wisdom, does two very important things. First, it says that he's very careful to record everything that happened. He realized God's deliverance for the Jews through this whole plot of Haman and all this is a really big deal. And it's so important that we need to remember this. So he records it. He carefully records it. Doesn't say he wrote the book of Esther. You wonder, whoever did, if they took from some of Mordecai's recording. Don't know. But what we know is that first he records it, and then the second thing is he uses his position of influence and authority to ensure that this celebration would be remembered for generations to come. That this would be something that no Jew would ever be able to forget. It was that big of a deal. And then we kind of see this over and over. So first they celebrate, then Mordecai commands that they celebrate, and then we're going to see that they accept it for themselves, that the author's really emphasizing this celebration, verses 23 through 28. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pure, that is, cast lots, to crush and to destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the term pure. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, The Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written, and at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. The author now is taking pains to help us understand two things. First, why there's 2 different days, right? It's explained multiple times. Well, it's because some of the Jews celebrated on the 14th day and some on the 15th day because there was 2 days of fighting against the enemy, right? The author really wants us to know kind of why it's happening on the 14th and the 15th day. And second, why it's called Purim to begin with, right? Every holiday has got to have a name, especially if you're going to remember it and keep practicing it. So what do they name it after? Not Esther, not Mordecai. This great irony. They name it after the very thing that Haman banked on that would give him success in killing the Jews, which is, if you remember, after getting the king's approval, he cast the lots, the pure. He cast them because in his superstition, believed that whatever that date was the date that he would have favor on his side to defeat the people. And the irony, of course, is that is not how it happened at all. That it's the opposite. The power and sovereignty of God instead was on display on the 14th and 15th days of Adar. And so God, even though, again, not mentioned, clearly is the one who is being celebrated, right? The festival of Purim is not named after Esther. It's not Esther's festival. They're not celebrating Esther. It's not Mordecai's festival. They're not celebrating Mordecai. Who are they celebrating? The one who can take Haman's surefire lots and have it totally reverse and bring about the deliverance of his people. They're talking about Yahweh. That is the origins of Purim. And now we have not 7, but 8 festivals and feasts for the Jews, with one more to be added later, right? Hanukkah, which I think is next week. That one was also added later as God delivered through Judas Maccabeus and that whole thing shortly before Jesus came. So they actually ended up with 9 by the time it was all said and done. So I just want to ask, or maybe rhetorically, did you know that it's okay to add holidays to our calendar? Before I was born, my parents created a holiday that was celebrated in our house that I remember celebrating every single year that I lived with my parents. And it was a holiday that I guarantee you've never heard of unless you've heard it from my parents. It was called Mustard Seed Day. You celebrated Mustard Seed Day, right? Of course you didn't. It was just our family. Here's how it all came about. My parents were trying to buy a house. I was in utero in my mom's womb, and they were trying to find a house. They felt really discouraged with the market down in Beaverton, Oregon, and weren't sure they would ever be able to afford one. And one day, my mom was out walking with my older brother and sister, and she saw this for sale by owner sign that had just been put up. And it was this ugly, mustard yellow colored house. And they had to sell real quick. They were in a real rush to just get this off their hands. And so they didn't bother to paint the house. And it was a real eyesore, right? For my parents, this was providential because they were able to negotiate. It was something that they were able to afford, and it was all based on this ugly yellow color of the house. So, yes, they did paint the house, but every year they decided this is something that we want to celebrate in our family because God really provided. He really came through. And so the idea was it was a mustard seed day, right? A little mustard seed of faith combined with the mustard yellow. So we would go and get Chinese food because it was kind of yellowish color type food. Now, this happened before I was born, but I can tell you, I loved Mustard Seed Day. October 19th, every year, we'd get to go out for Chinese food, and my parents would retell the story of how they got the house. Again, I wasn't even alive. Well, I was alive, but I wasn't even born yet when this happened, and yet I looked forward to the holiday because I love Chinese food, and I just love that there was some story to it. Now that I'm a parent, and Sabrina and I have realized there's some real genius to creating family holidays of remembering God's faithfulness. I've seen how powerful that is as I heard that story over and over again. So a little ways back when Gracie was, 2, and Sam was just a few months old, we were driving home from church, and another car ran a stop sign, and we got in a pretty bad car accident. Van was totally totaled. It really especially shook up Gracie, just being a little 2-year-old, And we were trying to think together, like, how do we help her? She would have nightmares about it, How do we turn this for her? And so it was May 21st when we got in the car accident, and obviously, God provided another van for us, another Toyota Sienna. Got to say, I'm still part of the club. But we thought, what if we celebrated the day of the accident and actually turned it into a celebration of God's faithfulness because he took care of us and provided a new van. And so we called it Vantastic. And we started celebrating Vantastic. Now, I asked my kids on the way in if they remember that we celebrate Vantastic, and they really didn't. And so I think we've been slacking with Vantastic. But there is one that we've done a really good job, and they look forward to every year. And that was this, Sabrina and I were just trying to think, how do we really emphasize to our kids that our marriage is really important? It's important to them, right? That mom and dad have a strong marriage. And so we were trying to think, is there some way that we could make our anniversary, which we look forward to, something that they look forward to? And it was Sabrina who had the idea. We got married on a hot, sweltering September 8th summer day, and we, for our reception, did pie and ice cream. And so she said, well, what if for breakfast on our anniversary, we let our kids have pie and ice cream to celebrate our wedding? They love it. I cannot even tell you. It's the only day they get pie and ice cream for breakfast, and they can't believe, they pinch themselves every time. But we do it, and we've done that faithfully every year, and they love it. And we show our wedding video and then talk about, just what marriage is. And it's one of those things that now our kids look forward to. That is the whole thing that just happened with Purim. And that's something that we can do too. Like, God is calling us to be people who remember and celebrate his faithfulness. Well, I don't know about you, but I am really quick to forget. Are you a good forgetter? Any good forgetters in the room? Boy, am I. And so I am so simple-minded that I need stuff like this to remind me of big things that God has done in my life. So I just want to get those wheels turning in your mind. Are there some holidays, some celebrations, call it what you will, that you could start in your family to really celebrate God's faithfulness? Because that's what Mordecai and Esther and the Jewish people do. Now, Esther's getting on board. Look at verses 29 through 32. It says, then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority, confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fasts and their lamenting. The command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. And as we know, Purim is celebrated to this day, right? Jews all over celebrate God's faithfulness millennia ago. And how cool is that they still pass it on to the next generation and the next. I know they have these cookies that kind of look like an ear, and they're filled with like fruit filling, and it's kind of like you're eating Haman's ear, And I love that because it's very edgy, right? But two, as a kid, you are not going to forget that, right? Not only are you booing Haman when his name is read, but you're actually like pretending to eat his ear. It's so sticky. So if you have an enemy, there's a holiday for you. Do something with their ears or something. But again, this is emphasized. This is like the third or fourth time now that the author is explaining this. Why? Because it's so important. Why are feasts, festivals, celebrations, why are they so important? They're so important because it helps us as a family unit. You and your spouse, you and your kids, your grandkids, whatever. It helps within the family to remember what God's done in your lives. For Christians, it is so important because it reminds us that all of these deliverances of God's faithfulness are just mirrors of the gospel message. Are they not? Like, there's no greater reversal than Jesus dying to save his people. And it says in Colossians 2 that through his death on the cross, he put to open shame the authorities and spiritual powers. Like, his moment of defeat on the cross, when I think Satan thought he won, is now flipped, reversed on its head, and it's now the moment of open shame for Satan and demons. Like, Jesus did that. And all of our celebrations are our little picture, God's faithfulness, a little picture of the gospel. This is a big deal for unbelievers. We still have a few holidays in our culture that do point to Jesus, don't we? Christmas being one of them. If we can get back to what it's all about, not the commercialism, but the fact that it's about Jesus. We were watching the newer version of The Grinch, that came out a few years ago with Benedict Cumberbatch. And I still am shocked that they let so many Christian Christmas songs in that movie. God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, and there was a couple more. And it was so blatantly, I shouldn't be so shocked that they have Christian Christmas songs in a secular movie. You know what I mean? Like, that shows more about probably my desensitization and where our culture's going. But if we can get back to Christmas, what it's all about, here's an opportunity where everyone's already thinking about Christmas. That's called a cultural compass. Something that points to the gospel that's in everyday life. We're trying something new because of a number of you who have set this example of doing some kind of event. For some of you, I've heard of talking, you do it in the summertime, where you do a barbecue and invite your neighbors. Others of you do these open houses during Christmas time. We're going to try it this year. We invited all of our neighbors to come to an open house at our house this Sunday. You can be praying from 3 to 5. And we have no idea. It could be a no-show. We might just have a bunch of snacks and it just be our family. Or maybe a whole bunch of people will come. We don't know. But our hope is that, one, it'll help build relationship through eating, enjoying, but also it's a Christmas open house, and maybe have just some little opportunities to plant a flag about Jesus. Would you pray for us? And I appreciate this is a big reason because a number of you do this so well, and we're impacted by your example, so thank you. That is the power of celebration, though. It's for everyone. Look at verses 10, 1 through 3, and we will wrap up this book. This is kind of the conclusion of the matter. King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews, and popular with the multitude of his brothers. For he sought the welfare of his people, and spoke peace to all his people. The conclusion is, King Ahasuerus, who does the right thing in the end, apparently is blessed, right? He gets a whole bunch, all that wealth that he didn't get from this plot comes in anyway with taxes. And he was good at that. But I think the point of verse 1 is just to show that God actually rewarded even a secular king for doing what was right. I think that's why that's there. But more so, it's about Mordecai, right? And how he's honored. He's great. And it's ironic because he's the humble one who's not like Haman trying to seek his own greatness. But more than that, I think Mordecai here at the end is a type of Christ, right? An example in the Old Testament of someone who acts in a way similar to Jesus. What is it that Mordecai does that so reveres him to his people? He does two things. He works hard for the good of his people, and he speaks up for their welfare. Who more so than Jesus? Who pays the ultimate price for the good of his people, who doesn't keep silent but is the Word himself made flesh, right? Speaking up on behalf of his people, defending them, coming to their rescue. He's a type of Christ. I really like what Mervyn Brenman said, and I have this quote up as a slide. He said, Mordecai had gone through difficult days and had been in danger of death, but his crisis became, in God's providence, a stepping stone to greater influence. This fact is repeated often in the lives of God's servants. God doesn't waste hardship, does he? Was this an easy ride, smooth sailing for Mordecai to get to the top? No, anything but. It involved exposing assassination plots and encouraging his niece to possibly go to her death and standing up for what was right against a pagan authority in the court, and over, hard, and yet God uses it to give him more and more influence, more opportunity to use his wisdom for good. As we think about just the book of Esther as a whole, as we kind of come to the end and conclude, we really have so much in common with the people of Israel who were scattered throughout the Persian Empire during that time. We too are living in a time where Christians are now moving to the sphere of being despised and hated, not just disagreed and tolerated, right? We are in a situation very similar to where Esther and Mordecai find themselves in, where people are plotting their harm, where they are opposed to them, even to the death. My brother-in-law shared with me an article that I thought was very insightful by a professor named Carl Trueman, talking about this Defense of Marriage Act, right, that was just signed into law yesterday, and how this is a great example of how so many Christians are being tempted to compromise, to say, well, maybe I personally disagree with gay marriage and some of those things, but I'm not going to publicly come out against it. And he says this, I thought this was insightful, and this is going to be a longer quote, but I think you'll see why. He says, the older generation, talking about Christians here, the older generation who matured in the shadow of the battle for the Bible assumed that it would be Christian doctrine, belief in the incarnation, the resurrection, the miracles, that would be the fault lines within the churches and the reason why the outside world would repudiate Christianity. That generation thus lived in a world where such things played no role in actual membership in wider society. They might make Christians look foolish, but they did not make us look evil. And in that world, Christians could compensate for their perceived foolishness by combining Christian orthodoxy with a certain cultural savvy and sophistication. But those days are over, and that leadership is ill-equipped for what is now happening. Then he says, being mocked for believing in miracles is much easier to handle than being hated as a bigot. And it is now obvious the Christian position on the key issues of membership in society today, those of sexual identity, gender, abortion, cannot but implicate one in public debates and will merit the title of bigot. Being literate and urban, being able to mix a good martini vesper, such things simply will not compensate for the rejection of whatever identity, act, or right progressive society next decides is non-negotiable. And we now need church leaders and thinkers who understand this and are prepared for the social consequences. Boy, isn't that true? Are you ready to face being called evil, being called a bigot, to being saying that your beliefs of what's best for someone else are actually dangerously harmful to those people, so much so that you might need to be one day, maybe soon, imprisoned or fined or whatever for your hate speech? Like, are we ready for this? I don't know about you, but I kind of don't prefer this path. Do you? Like, could we have the good old days when, you cuss in public and you call the police, and yet God has called us for such a time as this, just as he called Esther and Mordecai for a time when they would be hated so much so that they would be tried, attempted to be annihilated. It reminds me of the great theology book, The Lord of the Rings. Thank you. When Frodo and Gandalf are having this conversation, and Frodo's just lamenting that all of this, Sauron's rise and Gollum finding the ring and all of this happening during his life. He says, "I wish it that need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." True. Like Mordecai, no matter what it costs, we have the opportunity to seek the good, not just of each other, of Christians, but of society, the true good of society, and to speak up for what's right, which is exactly what Mordecai did, seeking the good and speaking up for what's right. Now, there are some who would come to the end of the book of Esther, and they'd say, this whole story is circular argument for the existence of God. But when you think about it, all you did is you had a crisis that was manufactured and a crisis that was resolved, and nothing's really changed from the beginning to the end of the book. The Jews were alive, they were threatened, they're alive again. And it's true that many monumental events in life hang on some small, seemingly inconsequential moments. But where that is completely false is going through hard times, going through challenges in life, they don't leave us unchanged, do they? Let me give you an example. That's like saying in the movie Finding Nemo, if Nemo would have just obeyed his dad in that one moment and not swam out of the reef when the guy pops up, and takes him back home as the pet, like the whole rest of the movie could have been done right there if he would have obeyed his dad, and they could have finished school and gone back to the reef, and that would have been the end of it. Make for a really lame movie, but it could have been the end of it, right? That's how that crisis could have been resolved. But would we be satisfied if the crisis was resolved that way? No, because the problem still existed that Nemo and Marlin, his dad, didn't understand each other. They didn't have a good relationship. Marlin was still living in fear constantly, right? And Nemo needed to learn to obey his dad. And so this whole adventure that they go on all the way to Sydney, and the crazy whales that are talking and crazy stuff, right? Vegetarian sharks. The point is that by the end, Marlin and Nemo have been changed. They're different fish. I almost said people. They're different fish by the end, right? And Marlin realizes that he loves his son more than he's afraid of losing him. And anyway, the whole point of that story is, if nothing would have happened, what if Haman would have died as a child? Some people say, what if Hitler would have died as a child? Well, we can go down the what ifs all day long. But here's what we know. The fact that Haman did exist, and Haman did have this plot, no one finishes the story unchanged. Not a single person. The king is still pagan, I think, but he comes to the end trying to figure out how he can help Esther and the Jewish people. That's very different from the way he treated his first queen, isn't it? Esther goes from being this shy, timid girl to being so brave to put her life on the line to save her people, and now she's helping govern them. Mordecai, this humble man who has wisdom with his niece, is now using his wisdom to impact nations. Even Haman has changed, because by the end of his life, he is begging on his knees in front of a Jew instead of demanding that a Jew beg on their knees in front of him, right? Like everyone's changed except for one character, which is God, who is so consistent, who never changes, and yet everyone else does. And I think that is just the perfect way to wrap up the book of Esther. Everyone's changed on this journey, and God has proven himself to be the same again and again and again. I wonder if you had the opportunity to change some of the hardest moments in your life, if you could go back and somehow cause them to not happen. I wonder if you would. Or I wonder if you, with time and a lot of prayer probably, and God's grace have seen that even the worst moments in our life, God has used to change you, right? To fulfill his promise in Romans 8:28 and 29, that God works through all things for the good of those who love him, those who are called according to his purpose. And what is that good? Our happiness and pleasure and wealth? No, that they might be conformed to the image of his Son, that we would become more like Jesus. That is what he continues to do, so that you and I, like Joseph, can stand up and publicly say, what you meant for evil, God worked for good, for the saving of many lives. That is the book of Esther, and that is our life, isn't it? So we, I hope, will leave with hope tonight. Whatever you're facing, as we look down the pipeline in our culture, as we look at our own struggles and trials, knowing that God is working. He is. Maybe behind the scenes, maybe in ways just like in this book where he's not named, but he's working. And he's going to fulfill his promise to bring good and to make us more like Jesus. That is some good news, isn't it, church? Let me read some discussion questions, and then I'll let you loose at your tables. Question 1. What is your favorite national holiday and why? 2. Is it easy or hard for you to throw a party and enjoy God's blessings in your life? Why? 3. Have you ever created a new holiday or celebration to commemorate God's faithfulness? If not, can you think of any possible examples of God's faithfulness that could be celebrated? And then 4, do you ever get discouraged about the cultural moment of time we find ourselves in? How can the story of Esther give us hope in the midst of our circumstances? Okay, thanks guys. Have a great discussion time at your table.